Hello, apprentices, past, present and future. I want to try and tell you what I'm trying to do here. So, welcome to a rambling introduction to the soulful vision of the Apprentice Lounge. My journey in traditional medicine, as well as my journey in spirituality, really initially took me to the East. It took me to China. It took me to India. It took me to Thailand. It took me actually anywhere but the West. It took me to Mexico. It took me to Borneo. It took me to Mali. I was looking for soul. I was looking for tradition. I was looking for depth. And so I looked outside the West. And that's a common story for seekers and searchers in the 20th and 21st centuries, right? We look to the Amazon. We look anywhere but back to our own roots, right? To the deep core, thrumming, soulful, spiritual, healing tradition of the West. And so, yeah, I'm a doctor of Chinese medicine, and I spent like 6 internships in Ayurvedic hospitals and 3 in Tibetan hospitals and 3 in Mongolian hospitals. And I actually went to see the shamans in Siberia and hung out with the reindeer shamans in northern Mongolia and the shamans in Borneo in the jungles of there and the shamans in west of Timbuktu in the middle of nowhere. I went all over the world and I studied those traditions fiercely over a long period of time. And only after having gone through all of those traditions did I finally really, in earnestness, turn my gaze to the West. Now, I'd been practicing with Western herbs, yes, for most of that time, but I did so inside an Eastern framework, right? Jeremy Ross and Holmes, The Energetic of Western Herbs, Peter Holmes, authors like this that took Western herbs and translated them into Eastern concepts so that I could get dynamic and energetic and core archetypal patterns that made sense to me, right? Rather than the long lists of amenagogue and galactagogue and digestive and cephalic and stuff that were in the Western texts, right? And then I started rooting around in the Hippocratic tradition. Well, I mean, not exactly, but it makes a clear story. I mean, I went to Paracelsus. I'm an eclectic. I went to a lot of authors, but eventually, I went to the roots of the Western tradition. And that means ancient Greece, the Hippocratic tradition, because you can't understand Paracelsus, you can't understand Culpeper, you can't understand naturopathy without understanding the tradition that they stem from, that they reacted against, right? That they built upon, the shoulders of the giants that they stood upon, right? And so I went west, young man. I finally went west. And having studied, and I don't mean skipped across, I mean studied and become literate in Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine, deeply literate, I was expecting to find something lesser in the Hippocratic tradition, something a bit too logical, a bit too rational, a bit too dry, a bit too something. Because I had located all of soul and spirit, all of the transcendental and archetypal wisdom of the world. I'd located it everywhere else except in the West. And so when I started slowly reading through these manuscripts and these books and these articles online, I was shocked to discover that the Hippocratic tradition, the Western tradition all the way through, not just the Hippocratic tradition, the Western tradition all the way through, is roaring with soul, right? Roaring with soul. And not only that, but we taught the Tibetans urine analysis. We taught the Mongolians bloodletting practices. You know, our tradition is older than the Chinese tradition by centuries, older than the Ayurvedic tradition by centuries. And you think, yeah, but isn't it kind of like rational and dusty? Wasn't that the whole thing? No, it's roaring with gods and archetypes and myths and deep, deep, deep clinical insight. The oldest traditions on chi, on prana, on pneuma are in the West. They precede that of China by 3 or 4 centuries. And they're not superficial. They're profound. And I know this as an acupuncturist. They're profound, right? And it's out of that traditions like the hydrotherapy tradition emerge millennia and a half later. It's out of that core law, right? And it's out of that water cure tradition that naturopathy emerges eventually, right? And it's out of that, and it's out of that. Here, there's a deep, deep, beautiful tradition that lays in the West, roaring with spirit, roaring with wisdom. And remember, my degree was in Western philosophy and Eastern religion. And in Eastern religion, I studied Eastern philosophy. I've got shelves full of literature on Taoism and Tibetan Buddhism and Confucianism and Vedic philosophy. You know, like, I've studied those traditions, right? They are profound and worthy of our respect, right? So is the Western tradition. Heraclitus and Empedocles are rishis, sages and mages of equal standing with anything that I have encountered in the East, right? These texts are easily the equal of the Tao Te Ching, right? And such things. These authors, we've been misled. We've been misled, sweet friend, to think of the Western tradition as a rationalist tradition. That's the Enlightenment that happened. They looked back and they just picked out those bits and they kind of pretended that all the other stuff wasn't there, a bit like the communists did with Chinese medicine. They whitewashed it, they redwashed it, they took out the bits that they didn't like, you know, between 1950 and 1980. They took out the bits they didn't like in Chinese medicine and they made it a little bit more respectable. Well, the West did that for all of Western philosophy. You know, in the Enlightenment, when it was a rationalist era, they said, no, the Greeks were fundamentally rationalists. They weren't. They were holistic. They were incredible. It was more like ancient India than it was anything like, you know, like Enlightenment Germany, right? It is an incredible philosophy. And so in the Apprentice Lounge, here, I don't want to teach you Tibetan medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, Chinese medicine. I don't want to teach you to think in the terms of yin and yang, right? Of vata and pitta. It's like, yes, we can touch upon those because you know more of that, probably. You've encountered that. You're more literate in yin and yang, whoever you are, than you are in terms of the West's tradition of love and strife, of Empedocles, who came up with the 4 elements in ancient Greece like 600 BC. But these traditions in the West are easily the equal. And not only the equal, but they're conducted they're transmitted in a poetry, in a syntax, in a cadence, in a scale, a tonal scale that speaks to the Western psyche. And in the same way that, you know, classical Chinese music is just like interesting. If you've heard classical Chinese orchestral music, it's interesting and at times beautiful, but it's a completely different scale than the Western scale. They're not using our scale. They don't have harmonies in the way we have harmonies. They don't have the same notes that we have. Same with Indian rugs. They're different notes, right? And that they can move us. But I believe that the Western scale of music which is not a natural scale that just exists through the division of strings. It was created by Western ears and Western minds and Western hearts, by the notes that resounded with them. And the language of traditional medicine in the West, the gods and goddesses, the myths and archetypes, the way in which the elements are defined and described and transmitted in the West, I think they go down and they unlock keys in ways that foreign philosophies can't reach. Not to say that they are less than, right? And I think if you have a Chinese tradition and a Chinese psyche, then the Chinese tradition and the Chinese philosophies and the Chinese myths, they will go all the way down and open. And it's like they have the enzyme to be able to digest that in the same way that the Indian subcontinent has more lactase and they can digest lactose better, and the Chinese don't have lactase and they can't digest lactose properly. Having studied those traditions as deeply as I have and learnt so much from them, the Vedic traditions, the Taoist traditions, learnt so much from them. I don't mean to denigrate them or say that they are less than, but I do mean to say that our tradition is equal to and geared to the Western psyche, right? It's in a language that can unlock something rather than keep us in a sort of mystical, mystified state, right? So that it goes down and actually works, transforms your state of consciousness. Imbibing Western traditional lore and myth is like taking entheogenic mushrooms. It changes psyche. And this is in our Western tradition. It's in our Western tradition. And the primary value to me of the Western wisdom healing tradition, rather than medical tradition, the wisdom healing tradition of the West, because those things are not separate, right? The primary value is not that, a future anti-malarial drug could be found inside it, but it could. It's not because there's, new alternative cures for warts and hemorrhoids and colds and cancers. There are. That's not the primary value, right? That's not the primary value of the Western tradition as I understand it. The primary value is that it preserves our cultural heritage in forms that are culturally, linguistically, archetypally, and psychologically well suited to the Western psyche. And if we keep looking east, if we keep looking to other cultures, consuming Amazonian lore and indigenous lore and Native American lore without looking back to our roots, I don't think we're going to get what we're looking for. And I don't think we're going to create the same culture in the West, and I'm speaking as a Westerner here, the same culture around us that we need, right? In the same way that individuals, when dealing with their neuroses and mental health problems, have to go back to their own past, look at their childhood wounds and wrestle with those things anew. We in the West have to stop looking outside for the solution and come back and wrestle with our past. And that's the value of traditional medicine. It preserves a different way of seeing and being. It's locked up in there, right? It's not in the data, it's in the poetry, right? It's in the poetry of it. It's like the pancreas that has that probiome that is just in case of emergencies when everything else gets colonized and you get dysentery and diarrhea and it's all good, bad and toxic and out it goes, then there's this little seed culture tucked away in the pancreas. Did I even get that right? Tucked away so that it can recolonize, right? And start up a healthy culture again. And that's what happened in the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, they looked back. It was a rebirth of classical culture, where Greek and Roman myths, Greek and Roman philosophy, Greek and Roman medicine, Greek and Roman wisdom came back to the West again. And it produced this explosion. I'm not saying that it's only Greek and Roman. I mean Celtic and Norse and a whole Western, right? That is in that Western scale. And so this is what's missing. This is what's missing in naturopathy and Western herbal medicine. And I hear it a lot, right? And so I've pulled off a bunch of books from my bookshelf here. There's a lot more back out there, but I've pulled off a bunch to illustrate the point, right? Every naturopath and herbalist has a bunch of textbooks like this by Kerry Bone and maybe Tisserand that are phytomedical textbooks, right? They've all got these, right? This is not traditional medicine, this is phytochemistry, right? It's a credible value. I have those textbooks for a reason, right? But it's in the language of the culture that colonized our tradition. Chinese medicine doesn't speak in terms of minerals and vitamins and cholesterol and hormones. Ayurvedic medicine doesn't speak in those terms either, right? But Western herbalists are prescribing herbs like Vitex as a progesterone booster. There's no tradition left in traditional medicine of the West as I see it. Yes, they're using some of the same herbs. Some, because there's a huge influx of obviously Oriental herbs into the Western, the average herbalists. You know, they got their andrographuses and their withanias and their ginsengs and all the rest of these things. There's still some, you know, there's the nettles and this and that. There's still some Western herbs. But simply using, and I mean that in the worst possible connotation, using the herbs of our ancestors does not make it traditional medicine. In the same way that a physiotherapist using acupuncture needles in a trigger point or even on acupuncture points, right, after their 2 days of training, does not make that Chinese medicine. It's not Chinese medicine. It's really not. A GP prescribing an Ayurvedic formula and say, apparently this is good for depression. It's nothing to do with Ayurveda. What makes it Ayurveda is the cultural context, the law, the systems of thought, the mythos, the poetry, right? If you're not thinking in terms of Vata, Pitta, Kapha, you're not practicing Ayurveda. If you're not taking the pulse and thinking in terms of yin and yang and the 5 elements, it's not Chinese medicine. It doesn't matter if you take a Chinese herb and give it to someone. That's not Chinese medicine, it's just a Chinese weed at that point, right? And so the same for the Western tradition. It's the same for the Western tradition. Using nettle does not make you in the Western tradition, traditional practice alone. You're using nettle and you're using it in a way that it was never worked with in the past. It was worked with in a very different way, inside a very different culture, inside a very different framework. And so let's keep going with some of the books. You know, everyone's got those books, right? And then, you know, you probably also, if you're a herbalist or you're a lay herbalist or a naturopath, you probably got some of these books. You probably got your Matthew Woods, right? Maybe you've also got your Moores, right? And then on top of that, you probably got a bunch of these books. What have you got here? You probably got Boona, Harrod Boona, all of these books. Maybe you've got a couple of Michael Tierra books. Maybe you've got Saja Popham's book, right? A newer one. It's like, that's fantastic. You've got all of those, right? And then, of course, everyone's got a copy of Culpeper. Everyone's got a copy of it, old and dusty like this. But do they consult it and can they read it? No, it may as well be in Mandarin or Sanskrit because the language that it's written in is no longer spoken. And so you're an indigenous person wherever you're from in the West. And there is a traditional language and a traditional law that's woven into this if it's a Saturnian herb, if it is damp and cold in the 2nd degree, what does that mean to you? It means nothing. You don't understand it because you weren't taught that language. Instead, you were taught the language of microbes, of bacteria and viruses and hormones and such things. And so you've got this text, this incredible text. It's an incredible text, and it's deeply, deeply Hippocratic and Galenic, right? It really, really is, despite the wonderful overlay of astrology. Just go to the back and look at Galen's method of physics. It's Hippocratic. It's building on that tradition. But you can't read it, and you're not practicing in line with it in any way, right? And so even though you've got it, and then as a naturopath, how many naturopaths in Australia have even got or read their Lewis Kuhns and their Father Knipes and all of these texts, right? These actual classical naturopathic texts, right? Of a drugless therapy, right? Nothing to do with the here, take these 7 supplements that's going on today after, performing some integrative lab tests. They were non-ingestible medicine is where they started with, right? It wasn't about herbs and supplements at all. It was completely different. But the framework that they inherited was our tradition, right? And I explain that to you. It goes to the water cure doctors of Germany, Vincent Preisnitz and Father Knipe, right? That's where naturopathy comes from. And from there, those concepts are rooted in Hippocratic texts, ultimately, and understanding, like on breaths, on pneuma, right? This is naturopathic medicine is rooted in that tradition, or was rooted in that tradition, and is no longer. And so, what are the other texts that you don't have and you don't read? It's just like, well, do you even have text by Galen, right? The great Hippocratic champion, right? Or Avicenna. Do you have Gerard's classic, right? And can you read it? If you did, no, you couldn't. It also could only be, it may as well be in Sanskrit, because you've been robbed. You've been robbed of your traditional law and your traditional language, the poetry of this tradition that is so damn beautiful, right? And it doesn't just go back to the 5th century BC in Greece with the Hippocratics, right? Obviously, the Hippocratics are a part of an oral tradition that goes back thousands and thousands of years, like the Vedic tradition and the Chinese tradition, right? There's an oral chain that goes back before the written record, but there's also all this other stuff, this incredible stuff that you haven't heard of. Authors like Parmenides, authors like Empedocles, that are practicing medicine, but are mages and sages. They are shamans. They're like Pythagoras. They're mystics. And some of their texts are preserved. And they are woven into and drawn upon by the Hippocratic texts. So we're talking about a tradition in the West that just goes back. It goes back into the pan-cultural shamanic law that just saw no boundaries, that just moved, that was animism that was across the globe in this way, right? We are rooted into that. We're rooted in spirit. We're rooted in soul. We're rooted in mystery in the Western tradition. But a war has been waged upon it for the last 300 years. Maybe you blame Paracelsus for some of this and what he did, the burning of the books. But it goes through the 20th century, right? Really significantly, right? In 1914 in the States, you know about all of that stuff. But it continues to this day. It continues to this day into the colleges, where a process of assimilation, like the White Australia policy that assimilated Indigenous people, was said, come over here, just forget about that Indigenous stuff that you do, that Indigenous way that you eat, that Indigenous religion and law and magic that you've got, and those Indigenous beliefs that you've got. Forget about that. Come over here and learn English and dress in shirts and pants and eat damper and white flour and sugar and drink booze, and here's some Christianity for you. Assimilation. That is still what's happening to the indigenous medicine of the West today. And our colleges are enabling and perpetuating that. Why? Because your teachers were taught by people that didn't speak the language. Your teachers, wonderful teachers, wise teachers, experienced teachers, teachers that gave you stuff of value, or teachers that you haven't, if you haven't studied at those colleges, that's what they're like, you know. There's real value there, but they were disconnected from their tradition too. And they didn't think and speak in terms of pneuma and fire and water and the phlegmatic constitution and the melancholic constitution, and they didn't read these texts either. But these texts are here. They're here. They're still here, despite the attempts to erase them, right? To ban them, to burn them. They're still here. And that language, that archetypal language of the West, it's still here too, because it is the language of Gaia. And it's very similar to Ayurvedic and Chinese medicine in its core. It's speaking in terms of nature metaphors, of mountain and sky and lightning, of earth and wind and fire, of breath and of blood, right? Of the vital spirits in the heart, right? The distillation of pneuma into imaginal pneuma and consciousness. Galen mapped these things, right? Galen. Aristotle wrote on these things. Aristotle wrote on pneuma a lot, and he did it well. It's incredible. But you don't think of Aristotle like that. Plato studied with mystics, the Orphic and Pythagorean mystics. He's popularizing material that he inherited, right? But you think of him as logical. You think of the Republic, and you don't think of the Phaedrus, right? Our tradition is sacred and roaring with soul. And my deep, deep desire is to give that tradition life, to breathe my life breath into it, and to share it with you so that it can continue, so that we can have a renaissance, a second renaissance, a rebirth in the West of a culture that looks to the future but is rooted in its past, right? That understands its own law, L-O-R-E, a sane culture that has a past that it's not ashamed of, and that takes the goodness and the wisdom and the glory and the insights of that to help us out of the insanity of modernity. It's like visiting your grandma, right? Or your grandfather, to hear stories upon their knee. This is what I dream of doing and sharing and being a part of with those that apprentice to me. If you yearn for this, and if you've come this far, you yearn for this. You've already found that it's not in the colleges that you got your degrees from, or you looked at their syllabus and you thought, I don't think that's got what I want. Let's find it. Let me share it. Let me point the way. Let me point out the texts. Let me share the stories with you. Let us be a part of a second renaissance. The wisdom, healing tradition of the West is yours, sweet friend. It's in your blood and it's in your breath. It is your ancestral birthright.